Just waiting for a few people to log on and join us here. Hello, this is Audra. I'm with DWF Live. This morning, our staff, we were all learning a bit of Cree. So Annie, it is wonderful to see you. I'm very excited that we get a chance to talk a little bit today about a few wonderful topics with Michael Etherington, who is an incredible speaker, trainer, Indigenous relations consultant. And I've had the opportunity to learn a lot from Michael lately. In fact, he even did some training with our DWF team, and he does a lot of other cultural trainings and teachings and helping us to understand things like reconciliation, what that concept really means, relationships, and how we can connect better. Treaties Recognition Week also is coming up next week. From November 1st to 7th in Ontario. It's a time for all of us to recognize that we are all treaty people. So we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. And Michael, I've just been so appreciative of the way that he has been able to answer questions, because he's done training for so long with so many different groups of people that he has the ability to really connect and realize that we're all on our own journey of learning. So I encourage you, if you have questions today, feel free to post them in the comments. If you're hosting a watch party on YouTube or Facebook, you need to go to the original stream, but post a comment or a question, and I can bring it forward to Michael as well, because I know he'd love to share. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. I don't know if you realize, but he's actually been a speaker on TEDx. He's appeared in the Globe and Mail, other news and TV outlets, Maori TV, so he's international. And he has also been doing a lot of other work that even brought him to writing his own book that will be released next year. His book's called Reconciliation is Not Dead, Finding Your Voice and Finding Your Story. And family roots, he comes from the James Bay region, and I know he'll be sharing a bit more about where he comes from and also how understanding our origins and points of connection can help us to create a better place for us all to live. So I'd like to welcome Michael Etherington. Hi, welcome. Oh, sorry, we just missed that hello there, Michael. The stream was cutting in and out. Can you just let us know a little bit more about you and where you're from?
Yeah, sure. Well, good afternoon to everyone that's here viewing, and also Audra and the DWF group for inviting me to share a bit of my time and my story, and just contribute a bit of my perspective and insight into the work that I've been doing, and just also some of my journey as well. So for where I'm from, as mentioned, I'm from James Bay. Both my family are from Moose Factory originally. And I have 3 parts of my family. So my mom did remarry. So I come from the Etheringtons, the Chichus, and the Moore families. And many started in the northern parts of James Bay, and then they all settled down into Moose Factory. So you think Moose Knees far north, they come from even further north originally. And so I think with my my story is also a part of how I interpret a lot of the conversations I've been doing with cross-cultural trainings as of late and working with community members, because I find with the way my journey has been, it's been, I'd say, a personal transformation first and foremost. So as opposed to taking these conversations, especially with discussions revolving around reconciliation, and putting the onus onto Canadians that aren't Indigenous, there's a challenge I find too as well, specifically with regards to leadership capabilities, about how this message is relayed. So for example, how my story, I think, is an important factor about how I want to understand, well, who am I in this conversation, as opposed to understanding, well, who are you or who are we? So first and foremost, that I think that's a strong evaluation. So with my personal story, just to give you a bit of insight, I've mentioned in prior engagements, I think this kind of gives insight to the way I interpret things, is that I have a bit of a balance between urban and remote living. But the origin of that, how that was based upon family challenges, and so many are familiar with regards to intergenerational issues about the legacy and impacts of residential schools. And that has impacted my family directly, both from a first generation perspective of my parents and my aunts and uncles and my grandparents and et cetera. But within that, though, it created a lot of challenge and conflict about how do we move beyond that legacy. And so my mom, specifically, her name's Thelma Chichu, she told us as a family, saying that even though these things have happened to us, it doesn't have to be your story. And so I think that has been instrumental for about how I interpret some of the ongoing experiences that I've been going as a child and youth into where I am today as a community member. And so I'll just want to give one example as a premise. In my personal background, prior to the age of 18, we lived in about 15 different homes. Now, that wasn't a result of being involved in child welfare. It was the result of transitioning from our community to the urban areas on these personal experiences. But I don't want to go into detail about my parents' experiences because that's not my story to tell, and I don't want to misrepresent or misinterpret. But there have been things that have influenced about how I transitioned into the urban area. And why that's important, though, is because when I say about prior to the age of 18 and 15 different houses, one of the core elements for someone like myself in my journey was understanding stability. So in my work and experience, I've met so many people. I ask them, how many homes have you lived in? A lot of them usually say one or two. They'll say, well, you moved maybe a couple of times as a child, but predominantly I've seen quite commonly people move 1 to 3 times. But for someone like myself in 15 different spaces, you don't get comfortable with the space. And so as of late here, I've been in Toronto for close to about 9 years now, close to a decade. And I've been here at my current residence for close to 6 years now. So in talking about personal journey, ethics, and attitudes, it's always an ongoing process about how we establish our basis about who we are. And so within that, though, how it relates to my professional aspect, I've been noticing there's a big geographical divide in this conversation with reconciliation between urban and remote. So as growing up, I used to see some like really the direct challenges. If you look at some of the social issues that are ongoing. But when I came to the urban area, I've seen a completely different perspective about specific issues. I'll give you one simple example. So many of us as Indigenous peoples are labeled and classified to death. What I mean by to death, you have these terminologies and bureaucratical terms that are not about who you are, where you come from. They're prescribed to you. And unfortunately, if you don't have any context or foundation to challenge these terminologies, they may perhaps become part of your identity and how you interpret yourself as part of your worldview. So what I'm talking about is when you talk about status Indian, when you make reference to Native, Indigenous, urban Indigenous. But for someone like myself and my story, when I was growing up between these differentiating geographical points, people in the north would say, "Oh, city Indian." Not like for me specifically, but you'll hear people say that. They'll say city slicker or city Indian. And then when you go into an urban area, people have as a platform for their organizational mandate saying urban Indigenous. Now, one's supposed to be an advocacy tool regarding catchment of services and how we relay, but another one has a negative connotation. But they're the same, pretty much the similar terms. So when you think about these challenges, there's mixed messaging that's ongoing, and there's I think my point is right now is that there's a major wall and barrier between on reserve and off reserve and remote and rural communities and urban perspectives. So a lot of my work about what I'm sharing, my story is my story. I don't misrepresent or try to speak on others' affairs or highlight what they've experienced. But also secondarily, I want to ensure that I find a balance in what I discuss between urban, remote, and rural, because right now I find that there's a lot of ambiguous narratives that are just overgeneralizing this conversation and bringing Indigenous peoples into one large melting pot, and it's creating a lot of confusion, and more importantly too, for quote unquote non-Indigenous Canadians, they don't know where to start. And so I think for this conversation is about how do we take it back and then develop an understanding to be more self-reflective of who am I first.
And you've done so much training with so many different groups of people, and I'm sure that, you know, so often when we approach learning, we think about an outside perspective and how to kind of put that inside our mind so we can understand, but actually asking who am I first in whatever conversation is such a powerful place to begin. I think that for many people, an understanding of rural and remote, or more specifically of urban Indigenous communities versus First Nations, like a lot of people, even the confusion around some of what might be happening in treaties and all of that is also not understanding the governance structures in the Indian Act or some of the things like very complex layers. Mm-hmm. So when you are training or when you're starting these conversations, where's the very first place you begin? Like, is there a place that even for people watching that when they're having that first conversation with a family member or a friend, like where does one start when they're asking that question, who am I, but also what am I here to learn?
Yeah. Well, building upon that, when I said the who am I, who are you, and who are we, uh, fundamentally I noticed that many in these learning spaces, they skip that who am I process and go to who are you. So they don't want to feel as though they have to contribute or be involved in these spaces. So they will go, we'll get you as the presenter or the trainer. And they'll say, well, I like to learn more about Indigenous peoples and I'd like to learn more about this history and these points of avenues treaty. But I'm not going to contribute anything. I'm going to try to stay as neutral and as possible. But within that, though, I find in a certain sense, it has a subtle connotation to continue paternalistic attitudes. Is that you're putting Indigenous people and establishing the onus for them to be the agency of change. And so when you take that step back about being reflective, I find one of the unfortunate reality is that many Canadians have been socially conditioned to see Indigenous peoples from a position of disadvantage. Now, not just from like a local regional basis, it's quite it's on a national level. So, for example, when you think about some of the language, think about the stories that we've been hearing and what have been portrayed in media, perpetual conflict, injustices, and those are realities that need to be prioritized, acknowledged, and recognized. But when you think about that, though, some of the language that follows up with it is, for example, marginalized, an oppressed group, people that have been historically dispossessed. If you have experiences with, let's say, for example, trauma, if it's historical, unresolved, intergenerational, you may be defined as at risk, high risk, vulnerable. Who's defining that, and who's carrying forward that narrative? That's coming from an outside source telling you about who you are. So when you talk about colonialism and these historical avenues, that's how it happened when they established what they called the wards of the state, that you can't handle your affairs. We know what's in the best interest for you, and we'll determine how you're going to have your outlook on life and how you're going to carry forward in your story. And so I think what's happening right now is that my focus is more towards children and youth, because they're going to be the next generation carrying forward. And in my view, there are realities between those who have a direct experience to these injustices and issues, but I have a big issue on accountability and transparency for those who have an indirect experience, and they're using their perspectives to influence about how our stories are told. And so, for example, children and youth are going to be carrying a dated framework of bureaucracy, and I think it's time. Well, how can we move beyond that and break the mold? And so, when I look at this for many of these learners in spaces, is that when I use this process here as a visual tool, when I go back to here, when you talk about nation to nation, the premise of treaty, you're talking about two groups that equally recognize each other to be negotiable, to establish partnership and understanding. But the conversation has shifted, and there's an imbalance in about how this is viewed. And so for many Canadians, they see this conversation from here, and they have this top-down approach, like when I mentioned paternalistic, is they view Indigenous peoples from this position of disadvantage. And if you've experienced these challenges, you may believe that, and you may feel that you need an outside source to really create a catalyst for you to change your life and outlook and hopelessness and feelings of despair. But I find, if you want my view, there are certain realities about programs and services that are necessary. But the secondary thing that I'm quite concerned about is about how trauma has been a culture to create victim-based narratives for those who are indirectly experienced. And so it's not my role to define and interpret how you tell your story, but from a broad systems perspective, there's a challenge about, well, how do we maintain this integrity without devaluing Indigenous peoples, and also getting their stories influencing how they perceive this. So when I say about in my spaces from the onset of these conversations, I ask people from this conversation, right from the onset, do you see this from a position of disadvantage, or do you see this from a conversation of equals? And I can tell you, in my experience, definitively, many have interpreted from this, how can I help Indigenous people? What can I contribute? And I tell in my discussions, we don't need help. it's partnership, it's shared prosperity, it's mutual understanding. Because when you move forward together, you're going to be sharing that conversation. So reconciliation, to me, it's not a process about establishing positive relationships. The principles of treaty have maintained the integrity to ensure that the treaties or relationships are sustainable based upon principles. For example, if you look at the Tuawampuswantah Bill, they talk about peace, friendship, and respect. And now when we translate to that, how we can utilize this can be a platform for about how we live day to day, and then we move forward in building and sustaining relationships. So fundamentally, who am I in this conversation, I think, is where we should start this.
Great. So in relation to understanding treaties, and because some people, still don't understand that treaties are part of what's existing currently within Canada, and why we're seeing so much issue with what might be happening in Nova Scotia, what it actually means to have unceded territories like in Wet'suwet'en. All of these things that are happening, like we'll have conversations and people don't have that basic understanding. And we are coming into Treaties Recognition Week. So I was wondering if you would just give a bit of an overview coming from that place of understanding of like two equals coming together and having that conversation, what a treaty is and why it's important.
Well, in very simplistic terms, we're talking about it from like a FAQ perspective. A treaty is an agreement between two or more parties. So it's not just an exclusive group, but it could be multiple parties. So if you look at the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, there's multiple parties involved in this. It's not just between two exclusive groups, so it's between two or more parties. And then that follows through the thread of nation to nation. So a lot of individuals ask, and that confuses a lot of Canadians actually, how can you have a nation within a nation? And the precedent of that, so if you look at the legal structure in Canada, we fall under British common law. And so the common law, and then also you have the civil law processes from the French. Now, when you look at it specifically here about the nation-to-nation relationship, that legal precedent was established primarily from the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And so that legal precedent about how King George III said that we'll acknowledge Indigenous rights and title to land, and then we'll have to deal exclusively. So that created a precedent about how we move forward as a community for these fiduciary duties. So when you look at some of the language or concepts associated with treaty, I would say, one, ask yourself, well, how do I understand a treaty? Secondarily, how do I interpret nation to nation? The third thing is, though, not all of Canada has been ceded or established agreements through treaty. So, for example, you're going to have to examine and look at what they describe as ceded and unceded lands. So what I say on the basic aspect is ceded when you have an agreement or treaty in place, but unceded means that there hasn't been any type of agreement treaty in place, and they haven't relinquished or extinguished any right or title to their lands. And so a third aspect, though, I find that's important from, I'd say, an Indigenous worldview perspective, is the oral histories. So, for example, those have been recognized by the Supreme Court. But one of the challenges, though, for example, I come from Treaty Number 9 in the north, and in that treaty, many number treaties, they had established agreements, but there has been haven't been honored to the full extent of what they've agreed upon. And one of the paradigms that I've said is, so for example, let's say if you're using more modernized treaties, like say for example, number treaties, the comprehensive land claims, and those aspects, those have documentation, and they're quite thorough and they're quite explicit in what's being defined. But when you have an oral agreement between these parties, well, how do you hold people accountable to an oral history? And so one of the things I've noticed in Lombard, where I'm from, with the treaties and the federal commissioners and the provincial representatives that are involved in my area, is that they said, well, we didn't identify those, but then one of the commissioners had a journal that actually reaffirmed the oral interpretation of what was agreed upon. And so one, that's just being dishonorable. And I think that when you look at these treaties across Canada that aren't being honored, and the thing is, though, they have been harmonized and working with Indigenous law and Canadian law. So there are specific aspects in recognizing Section 35 of the Constitution Act, which affirms treaty rights. But But the other thing that you can consider too as well is what I think about, for example, the oral history perspective. That's context. So I'll give you an example. If for someone like myself, generationally, my background as an Untitled Cree, let's say someone in my family was participant in treaty, and generationally they'll pass that knowledge down. And then when it comes to me in 2020, I still have that context and understanding. But let's say if you talk about Canadians who come from, let's say, a settler background, and they're, let's say, for example, a participant of the treaty in their history, and let's say the next generation, they decide to drop that and say, it's not relevant. And then you get to these multi-generations, and then today we have these parties talking with each other. One has context and the other doesn't. So then you're going to have misunderstanding, and you're going to have these conflicts arising when we do these engagements. So I think an important element about establishing our understanding of treaty and rights to land is that we're all participants, whether we know it or not. But I think what's important, though, is that providing a space and a foundation for us to engage in sharing space to build understanding. So right now, that understanding in that space should be through educational reform. So for example, I think right now we're having too many of these side conversations where we're having small demographics of the community who are building their knowledge and their awareness bases. But to a large extent, though, that's not going to create any meaningful and sustainable change. And so what I believe now is that, for example, I remember one thing I do have to identify is that I'm nonpartisan in my conversation. I don't have any political stripes. I don't devalue anyone in various aspects of the political spectrum. But when Premier Ford was elected, they dropped what was called the Indigenous Education Portfolio. And until we see this conversation not as a exclusive narrative to Indigenous people, it's shared about it just being education as to all Canadians. And so I think until we get out of that frame of mind about being an exclusive narrative between isolated groups and more about a shared pathway that we can all walk together and stand by each other, I think that's going to create meaningful change. Because if you look at demographics, for example, you say Indigenous peoples represent 5% of the total population. Now, how are you going to hold a group accountable if you're such a small margin of Canadian society? I think right now, as an analogy, I always reference the sleeping giant in Thunder Bay. So if you go to Thunder Bay, it's got that visual, that sleeping giant. And I think that is the representation of this country, is that we are a sleeping giant. And I think Louis Riel has mentioned a quote about, my people will sleep for extended period of time. But also secondarily, I think many Canadians are sleeping in this. And it's not every Indigenous person's role to wake up the public consciousness, but we do need to have strong leaders who are ready to build those bridges. And we can't be emotionally reactive if we're experiencing certain challenges and conflicts. We have to maintain the integrity and the principle of these treaties to guide it, but more importantly, awaken the Canadian spirit and reshift the social fabric about what it means to be Canadian. So for someone like myself, if you ask me, I get asked this a lot, do you identify as Canadian? And for me, I would say yes. Reason being is because Section 35 has recognized the rights of treaties, etc. But I cannot say I'm a proud Canadian. That's I'd hope to one day, maybe down the road, say that I'm a proud Canadian if we have the shared prosperity with these treaty relationships intended for all of us to be mutual benefactors of the resources and land, but also being stewards of the land and caretakers of the land. But right now, just so people have a premise, I am Nisgago Cree. We have a treaty relationship, but it's at the same point though is that I want to get to the point where I can say that I'm proud to be Canadian. But right now, I'm disheartened.
I think so important to recognize, and I know that even for many non-Indigenous folks who start to learn a bit more about the True History residential schools, or starting to wake up themselves to some of the realities of what Indigenous communities are faced with these days, there's a bit of that sleeping, the waking up or the awareness. And some of it gets spread through social media. Like my Instagram feed gets full of, seeing what's happening with the lobster fishing out east, or what's happening in turn at 1492 Landback Lane. Tom Wilson got arrested the day that he did an interview with us. Things like that, for bringing food to the land defenders there. So there's many non-Indigenous folks that are starting to say this is important and I'm wanting to share this. But I know you also talk a bit about the oversaturation of very heavily politicized info and how that can impact us having that relational conversation. So I'm wondering if you'd share a bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, what spurred that viewpoint as well was when the Wet'suwet'en issue occurred with regards to Coastal GasLink, and I remember a title was streaming across Canada, "Reconciliation is Dead," and many believe that, and it was spreading across social media, etc. But I just found that if those occurrences are going to take our country back, there needs. That's why I say the need for a framework and principled approach about how reconciliation is interpreted and defined. So the first thing I thought and considered, there's a challenge with government-based reconciliation. So what I mean by that is that the 94 calls to action that did have a focused prioritization about what changes are made to address inequities and injustices and the legacies and impacts of residential school, the child welfare, and justice over representation. But I find within that, though, it becomes only a specific pathway that many Canadians have interpreted to be exclusive between the government and Indigenous peoples. So that's their conversation. I don't really have to involve myself. But then what happened, I thought a second thought too as well, is that, well, if you're saying reconciliation is dead, it's going to let a lot of Canadians feel like, oh, well, that's good. Well, if it's dead, I don't have any obligation, or I don't have any contributions and no necessary change. So I thought we should reinterpret one, knowing that it's a multifaceted concept. So it's not just it's not a definitive process between two pathways of these parties between the government and Indigenous people. I thought that you can have a trilateral relationship, and that trilateral relationship works in many avenues, but forget the government. I focus my priority between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians, and I don't need any type of state sanction or any legislated reform to share my message and share my story. But more importantly, if you have a voice and platform, well, what are you going to share? And so, when you're talking about 1492 Landback Lane, the Mi'kmaq, the issue of Nova Scotia, quite adamant that it's not my story to tell, and I'm not going to pretend or act like it's an injustice I'm currently experiencing. But I am cognizant of it, and I do recognize that's an issue, and that's why I mentioned I'm disheartened by it, because when you look at Nova Scotia, for example, if you go from the East Coast to West Coast, there's look at the language that they use for Wet'suwet'en. They use language such as terrorism. They use all these concepts that are sensationalizing and polarizing Canadians. And then when you go to the East Coast and Nova Scotia, they don't have the same response because they're not Indigenous peoples. The response they used was, it's a dispute. But with what happened in Nova Scotia, there are acts of criminality. So when you have these conversations of these conflict, there's a certain point where accountability is needed. So, for example, the two Indigenous members that were in a building, and then a mob tried to set fire to the building, and the RCMP are standing by, and they're standing by idly. Now, when you look at, for example, I'm not too sure if many people are aware, but the RCMP had an internal report called Project Sitka. And in Project Sitka, they started identifying people that are involved in land rights demonstrations. They use language such as lethal overwatch, and those kind of concepts are undertones about the relationship Canada has. So my point I might make, perhaps government reconciliation may be dead. Maybe it may never be achieved. If you want to look at the numbers, in 2000, Walkerton, Ontario, around May 17, 2000, became aware of the contaminated water issues in Walkerton. Walkerton took 198 days from the onset of being aware to addressing it to establish clean drinking water. If you look at that, they said the elected officials, they clinked their glasses and took a toast to drink to have clean drinking water. That's 198 days. That's 6 to 7 months. Now, if you look at some of the clean drinking water issues, the community is ongoing. One has 25 years still ongoing. Look at the discrepancy if you start using 190 days versus 25 years. So when we look at that, why would I focus my efforts about sharing a message about if they're not going to change? If you don't look at CBC, beyond 94 calls to action, the last time I looked in May 2020, only 10% of the calls to action were achieved or fulfilled. And so, I don't want to devalue or create an opposition against government officials. We need to work with them, and we need to collaborate and have dialogue. But the conversation should shift where you're prioritizing with Canadians, and if we can't hold them accountable, but if we as a collaboration and building sustainable relation community, and then we talk to them, you will see the immediacy and you'll see actual change happen. But what has occurred for far too long, it's just been relegated to being the Indigenous story and the Indigenous experience. And so I think until we can reshift the public conscious thought thing, though, we're all a part of this story in this conversation. So I think that's where I focus my work is about. We have to hold the government institution accountable, but forget that process. Look at the amount of years for lack of change, incremental change. So if we're going to have reforms and maybe perhaps a system change or any types of aspect, is that this is where the conversation should be prioritized. So flip it and understand, well, where can I start? And then secondarily, what can I do afterwards?
Powerful. I always learn so much when you're speaking. Just want to keep hearing. So for anyone who's watching, feel free to add a question in the comments and I can bring it forward to Michael. You know, your book coming out, do you know when it may be published next year? Reconciliation is Not Dead, Finding Your Voice, Finding Your Story?
Well, I delayed it because as a result, I was supposed to publish it for fall, but then with COVID, it pushed the timeline back. So I'm looking at spring 2021 to have it released. And
Great.
I went through multiple title changes and my first
I know we can't say the full original title on, so like we don't want to get shadow banned on socials, but can you tell us about your initial plan for the title of the book and why that changed?
Well, if I use it abbreviated, that should be okay.
Yes.
So, how this occurred was Bill C-262, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I remember watching Romeo Saganash, and he was in the House of Commons, and he made a point talking about willfully violating treaties and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And then he said candidly, and he says, why doesn't the Prime Minister go and say that he does not give a blank about Indigenous peoples? And it created an uproar. And the House Speaker asked him to retract his statement about the profanity. And I thought, well, they're not even listening to what he's talking about. There's a core issue about trying to bring this important international document in Canada, and then it's supposed to focusing on the content, and it is a visceral response. But they said, I'm going to focus on this sensationalized piece of what you just mentioned. And I thought that's kind of analogous of the national conversations that we're deviating away from the core issues and things that we should be discussing and addressing, and focusing and getting distracted by these sensationalized conversations. And so when I started writing my book, I became disheartened when I kept seeing about reconciliation being dead and not many people not believing it. And one of the things I always discuss and share, for example, when former Prime Minister Harper delivered the formal apology to Canada, my late great aunt was there. Her name was Margaret Wabidow, and she passed 2016 at 111 years of age. And my family used to tell me stories. My mom said, "Oh, I always showed her when you guys were little kids and babies, and she didn't speak English, only spoke Cree, eat traditionally. And her message always was about forgiveness. So she went to St. Anne's Residential School. She's older than Treaty 9. She was born before Treaty 9. And for someone like her, about what she wanted to share to us as the younger generation, especially for those of us in the community. So they called her everyone's granny. She's known as Granny Wapno. That's how I referenced her. But she was at that important time of the apology. But then the other aspect too, going on with these narratives, I found that people, when they talk about reconciliation, they use it from more of a like a nomenclature, an explicit definition, a legal interpretation. But for someone like myself, it's something that I've internalized as a catalyst for hope, and I actually genuinely believe that. And I've seen issues like I've experienced racism directly. I can give you examples, but I don't want to share. Just keep on these private experiences because I don't want to devalue what I'm sharing and make it about me. But another aspect too is that when I look at these ongoing challenges about believing in it, when I talk about these bridges, right now in Canada, we're moving further. We're moving further apart, and who's at a position is disadvantaged is the Canadian public. People have been isolated and molded into these fixed identities. You have conversations of the left and the right. When you look at some of the people try to use all these labels and classifications to define their virtue about how much they're doing. For example, even in the reconciliation areas for the Canadian public, now they're talking about allyship and solidarity and my settler privilege, etc. And I say, well, that's great and dandy, but that's in my categorization and my viewpoint that falls into lip service, symbolism, and gesturing. Like it's reason how that concept came to be. My mom told me a story one time about my late grandfather, Sinclair Chitu. He said, one thing is that you have all these words today, activist, environmentalist, all these ists and isms. And he said, back in our time, he said that we didn't need title. We just knew to do the right thing. So when you think about, if I had to apply a label or classification, I'd like to be labeled as a community member. And that's all I want. Like, that's all I really care for. I don't have any distinctions or differentiations about this conversation about who's right or wrong. Because another aspect too, as well, about reconciliation being dead, we have this increased narrative in Canada and the US where people are being so openly defined as being racist, etc. And in my viewpoint, that's who this conversation is needed for most. But what happens is, though, we push them out, and we wonder why we have these fringe groups on the outside of the community, and these increased aspects of violence and conflict. So I think to address that, it's not everyone's responsibility, but someone like myself, I do want to work with people like that and ensuring that there's spaces for them to unpack and learning. Because I always quote Jane Elliott. Jane Elliott said at one time, racism is a learned affliction, and anything learned can be unlearned. And so there's a process of unlearning that's needed. And there's also a generational gap in this country where many young people today, I'd say, that they're getting more aware of social justice narratives, and they are becoming agents for change, both Indigenous, non-Indigenous. But the other aspect, though, I'm also genuinely concerned for the generational gap of those who went to high school or went to and got reaffirmed messaging, perpetuating stereotypes and discriminatory views and myths and assumptions of Indigenous people. So we can't forget that. And I think in this conversation, my point I'm trying to make is that no one should be left behind. And if it takes a few steps back, even for someone like myself, I'll be willing to do that to meet people where they're at. And I think that's an important critical component about how reconciliation is, because I think right now we're getting oversaturated and we're getting inundated with all this, what I believe at times is dated messaging. What I mean by dated messaging is that the Canadian public at times are just being turned off because they've heard this story before. But how do we capture these opportunities to ensure that reconciliation doesn't continue on a decline? And so I think right now, for my viewpoint, is that we need to have these strong ethics and attitudes and core values to dictate that. So as a reference, they asked Nelson Mandela. So I think if you examine South Africa and the apartheid impacts about how he created change, if you look at his life story, I'm quite amazed when I read into reconciliation, and then you can transfer to learning more about how some of the correlations about apartheid. But he had a quote. He said, "We have to make the brain dominate the blood." So he said, if we don't create any meaningful change, he said, our country is going to go up into flames. Now, when you think about that, so for example, if I think about my own story about what's happened to my family, and one thing I'll just share as an example, as a personal story about the impacts and legacy of residential schools. My late uncles, two of them, Arnold and Archie, they were living up in Fort George, Quebec. And my mom told me this. I never knew about this till I was a bit older, but I started learning more about because I find for a lot of community members who have impacts of residential school, it became kind of a hush story. It's not something you just discuss openly around the dinner table. It's kind of it became a quiet reserve story where you don't want to ask your grandparents or your family because it's a sensitive topic. But I remember I learned my mom saying that RCMP took my uncles and they didn't see them for like a decade. And my grandparents were completely helpless for protecting them. And within that, though, if I looked at their story and experience, one, it shocked me. Like I mentioned with my mom, she said, it doesn't have to be your story. Because when I heard about it, it does anger you and it does create a certain issue. But does that experience going to influence my narrative of the broader aspect of what we see? So what I had to do critically during those periods of time was go through my own process of healing, and I'm still going through that. It's not just something that it's achievable as an outcome. It's something that's lifelong, and so we need these proper tools and supports to ensure that we don't allow conflict to overtake our vision for what we want to see changed.
Wow. There's so much, I think, for us to learn and unpack here. And Michael, you've inspired some great comments. There's a few hellos I'd like to bring in. Harriet, visitor, dropped in, popping in and out during my lunch. I always listen later when I can't sit and listen live. Great to see you, Harriet, as always. Stan. Wache, Michael, from Double M Country, your homeland. Keep up the great work. Did I say that right? Yeah. I realized earlier I was talking, we were learning Cree, and I said Annie instead of Tansy when I was saying hello earlier. Sarah says, brilliant. Yeah, she was agreeing to what you were saying. And Crystal asked a question. Are there any resources that you can recommend for us to read or watch on our own learning journeys? So much isn't taught in our schools.
I think a good starting point is actually I'm going to return back in 30 seconds. I'll show you the book you should get. I'll be okay. I'll just recommend some.
No, that's perfect. Grab the whole library while you're back there. A few books. Grab your family's album. I found out in the pre-interview that Michael's family, he has a musical background. I saw that he plays guitar, but turns out with his whole family, there's this whole music thing. Oh, he's back.
Okay.
You can tell.
So, I think resources are excellent. The first would be this one here, 21 Things You May Not Know About Indianac by Bob Joseph. And then as a follow-up to that, he has a secondary book called Indigenous Relations, Making Reconciliation a Reality. Another resource on terminology, understanding some of the historical overviews, I find this was an excellent resource called Indigenous Rights by Chelsea Bell. And that's a good primer for getting a basis of knowledge. But I think for a starting point, everyone should read this here and purchase a copy of Volume 1 of the final report of the TRC, because I think that's where this conversation started, and many attendees and survivors were brave enough to come forth and create the change, but also ensuring that justice was served in their stories. So that's why I'm very mindful to not have a strong opinion about recognition. And I don't want to devalue what has occurred as a precedent with the legacy of residential schools, because if you think about this narrative too, how Indigenous people were treated is a complex of idea that extends thousands of years to the onset and birth of Western civilization. So, for example, Indigenous peoples have always been referred to as barbarian, savages, and tribal. And that, when you look at Mesopotamia, always look at terminologies. Where did this all start? People reference doctrine of discovery. His call to action 45 asks to repudiate. But if you even go further back, it goes beyond the church. Right from the onset of Western civilization, they created all these concepts towards Indigenous people. So why I'm sharing that to you, it has been socially conditioned and deeply ingrained in Western civilization for thousands of years. And now we're trying to undermine a process that's only been around for 5 years. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And Senator Murray Sinclair has mentioned the truth is hard, reconciliation is harder. And so it's not everyone's role and function, but I think where it could be a starting point, whether it's from personal development or professional narratives, is we need to find those leaders who are ready, those leaders that are ready to step up. And I believe too as well, not to self-appoint yourself, because like Stan mentioned as well, Jay, like I always, my accountability lies to where I'm from. And I'm going to reference my grandparents. So when I go back home, I don't talk like this, by the way, back home. It's because we have like there's more to do in our community living day to day, that we're not defined by these politics all the time. But it's necessary for us to increase awareness and engagement. But I want to share this with you here. So this was, I mentioned, this Tamarack booth here. So when I was younger, my grandparents used to make these really large ones, and they used to be hunting decoys. And this could be a reference as I want to share within this conversation, because one, I always tell people it smells nice. Like it's tamarack. You can soak it, but when you look at—
Yeah, my grandparents used to have some.
Yeah, but when you look at this though, people, if they don't have context, they think it's a piece of art, but not realizing some of what it was originally intended for. And that creates a lot of the disconnects that we see today. Some of the things that we're representing is that we're becoming disconnected from who we are and where we come from. And I think there needs to be a realignment. And one thing I can stress for Indigenous community members, we have to realign the urban remote rural. Because in my belief, an evaluation, if we increase the trend of high urban representation, there's not going to be any trees left to honor, because many people are going to be in urban areas. So I'm very concerned right now about how messaging is misrepresenting or misinterpreted from communities' impact. So let's hear the stories from the local level. So for many of us here, think national, but we got to act local. But who's telling these stories? And for all of us here, I find that it's a big challenge with these geographical divides of urban, remote, rural. I can't stress that enough, is that I just find that there's so much mixed messaging ongoing. It's creating confusion and polarization as opposed to being beneficial.
Do you think some of that initial or that division, like we had mentioned earlier, like politically, because even just understanding that the federal government will be dealing with relations that have to do with First Nations on reserve versus provincial governments needing to be responsible for relationships or conversations and support systems that are provided within urban communities. So is there a way forward that you see in terms of course, there's the government or legal side, but how we can actually ensure that all of that, all rights and considerations are upheld?
Well, I think when you look at some of these when you look at the implementation of strategies, they're always defined by catchment, urban strategy, remote strategy. Well, I think there has to be there has to be a national strategy. So what I mean by a national strategy, a framework or some type of planning tool principle that brings us all together. So for example, how do we align ourselves when we start going into like our regional areas? But one of the things is though, I try to be consistent, and I'm not when I deliver my work, it's not developed on my interpretation. I looked at the calls to action about what should be prioritized and focused about as a point of discussion. So for example, I addressed number 57 and 92 primarily. I'm not recreating the wheel. And so I think what happens is, though, based upon certain mandates and functions, people try to prioritize what's beneficial to their work and portfolio. But I think beyond that, though, we have to develop something that aligns everyone together and finds a common understanding, because we're not there yet. For example, when you look at the TRC report, I believe it's on page 6 of the report. It does talk about establishing mutual beneficial relations. But if I pass the reconciliation portfolio to you and ask you to get it implemented, well, how are you going to interpret that if you don't have any context or understanding? It's going to create further confusion. And the other thing is, though, for example, if let's say 20 of us are sitting in the room, and if I ask 20 of you how to define reconciliation, if I get 20 different interpretations, well, how are we going to achieve something? We don't have a common alignment or understanding. So one, I believe for reconciliation should have a working definition that resonates and people can align with, so they know what they're doing, so people can collaborate. And how do we assess the milestones and things that are being achieved with regards to reconciliation? And there's a secondary thing: is the 94 calls to action the only point of value? So once, let's say, for example, in a utopian sense, is if all 94 calls to action achieved, is reconciliation over? No, it's going to always be an ongoing process about ensuring that relationships sustain each other, because we're always going to experience challenge and conflict. I always reference and think about the covenant chain, because they always talk about renewed relationships, about how we may at times lose our way and further apart, but we have to find things that bring us back together. And so I think right now, from the national level, there's too much ambiguity about where to start. So these for many Canadians, there's not an ample amount of resources and points of reference, and so I think there's the informative and factual piece that's starting an entry point. But how is that going to translate into your day-to-day relations? And I think that element gets overlooked a lot of times, because we get these heavily politicized narratives. And I find too, as well, is that you can have conversations and you can build relations and be actively involved in your community. So I'll give you an example. Social media, we get overly entrenched with all these messages and conflicts. I always ask people, what have you done in your community? If I looked at you and your story, if you speak proudly and loudly about what have you done in your community, I'm not talking about your territory as an Indigenous person, I'm talking about for everyone. Like, what have you actually done and contributed, and what will people say? So, for example, even for someone like myself, I believe in volunteerism. I volunteer a lot for children and youth. I used to work with Passages Canada, and that when I used to speak with children and youth, I could see their eyes, like they light up, and I thought, well, I don't want to change their perspective and story. I want to build upon that, and sure, because when I think on a national level with the educational reform, this has to go into the K-12. It's a necessity for it to go into educational reform for K-12, but also age-appropriate education. And I think that that'll gradually shift and change the narrative about what it means to be Canadian, how we can all contribute and be participants in this conversation. So there's the thinking national, but the actionable items are at the local, regional level. So ask yourself, what have I done in my community? And I think that's a good starting point for the conversation.
Excellent. There's some more comments here. I'll share a few, and we might have time for one or two more questions before we wrap up. Emily, we will be sharing the books in the comments. So for those who also heard that there were some books in the list, we'll be adding those in. Neil says, thank you, Michael. Always value hearing you talk and encourage real and genuine dialogue. Your work with education leaders makes a difference.
Oh, good wish, Neil. We'll go for it.
We also have a comment here from Bethany. She's asking, if an entire generation of students in Canada and around the world learned about the legacy of residential schools, what do you think would happen or change?
Generation.
So if all the students right now, because like when I was in high school or elementary school, this was not taught. The Gordani and Chani Wenjack Fund, we have our Legacy Schools program. We're trying to bring more awareness and education so that teachers can teach about it, whether or not they have the actual curriculum to do so. So yeah, I guess the question there is just what would shift if everybody knew?
well, one thing I'm concerned about is, well, how is it taught? I think
Right.
that should be the first question, because in my experience, I've seen in school settings where they bring in survivors to tell their story, and then I find that some I've seen firsthand become re-victimized, and but also the other aspect is this story just exclusive to residential schools? Because I know the public conscious is becoming aware about some of our dark chapters and legacies of assimilation policy in Canada. But this is one thing I've always emphasized. It's not episodic about what has occurred. It was a conscious effort to break down the collective and family and individual of Indigenous peoples. So if you go prior to that, the Indian Act was a method to break down the governance and leadership of Indigenous peoples. The reserve system was to create isolation. Residential schools was to break down and kill the culture of Indigenous peoples. The 60 scoop was to create division and divide, creating this urban remote paradigm that we're in. And now today, we're struggling with the breakdown of the individual. We got these programs and services and diagnostic tools, assessment models that are, if you wonder why we have these diagnosis of mental health challenges, etc. But what I'm concerned with, though, is about if you look at Canadian civics and what's being taught in schools, it can't just be isolated to one episodic event. It has to be quite extensive. And so the residential schools, what I find when we go through the process of learning, how if the educators aren't appropriately equipped, they'll create, I find, have a narrative that's going to have a certain viewpoint and sensitivity of how people approach and view Indigenous peoples. So, for example, when I talk about how our story is being told, I've mentioned if you look at honoring the final report about Survivor Speaks, there are other terms that people have attended residential schools who don't want to be associated with Survivor. They call themselves thrivers and strivers. Why would you identify someone who directly experienced an injustice and label that for being their reality? So why I'm sharing that, though, is that when we're looking at the curriculum, well, it's important for us about how TRC, and it did address the legacy of residential schools, but the educational curriculum has to be much broader and thorough than that. And I think so, because when you look at, for example, it goes into here, if you just learn exclusively about residential schools, you're going to look at it from this impact of the genocide that has occurred, and then you're going to create a certain viewpoint. But how do that? There's a contradicting narrative in Canada. Is one, you have the treaty relationship and the precedents of land rights and title, which has to do with nation to nation, and then you have the secondary aspect of assimilation policy. And these narratives are contradictory to ourselves. So I think that has to be done in a neutral manner, but also how you bring people forward. So it's going to be a long process of learning. So I think what Bethany mentioned, the learning can't just stop at residential schools, because that's going to, you want to have a full breadth of being involved, but also building connections and community. And our story never stopped there. And we're still carrying forward our story in different manners and however you interpret it for individuals, families, and communities.
As a final thought, and we wrap up, it's always I'm always learning so much. I could just keep hearing you speak all afternoon. But just a final thought on that as well is, we often with DWF we talk about Gord Downey's call to do something. Like, he stood on the stage in that final concert, called out the Prime Minister, called out everyone, and basically told us all to do something. And we Secret Path Week just finished, which was our national campaign to help move reconciliation forward through people engaging in what we call reconciliations. So we've talked about the learning and all of that. And I know a lot of people get worried about doing something, but doing it wrong. Do you have any final recommendations for people that are listening and watching of how to start, or what they can do, being mindful that there's a much bigger, that there's a totality of all of this that needs to be considered? But do you have any final thoughts on that?
Well, I think what's happening right now is creating a lot of sensitivity about doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing, what I shouldn't say. But if that becomes a concern, then I find that's going to be a hindrance to building meaningful relationships. And my biggest point that I'm always concerned about is influence of what they call narrative identity politics. And identity politics is creating a lot of polarization right now, exclusive groups. When you look at the usage and utility of identity politics, it was necessary when you want to elevate, for say, for example, the civil rights inequities and injustices that occurred for groups. What's happening now is taking a new form where it's becoming an exclusive narrative between groups. And so I find that these isolation in groups have made an exclusive aspect where you can't understand one another. And I find if you want to go through that manner about genuine learning is don't isolate yourself in this groupthink process. Just try to break down those molds and barriers and think of ourselves as human beings. And we're losing that element about how we can't relate to one another. And I think that's one thing I've always learned from my family about my upbringing is that you're never alone, because the land will always teach you. Because where I go from, for example, I just moved hunting with my uncle, and those things run fast. But when you go hunting, you go in the bush, you make a lot of mistakes, and it's very humbling when you go hunting and out in the land. And one thing you'll learn: you'll never do anything right. There's no such thing as perfect, but you keep building your capabilities and learning. So something like myself with like going in the bush. It's quite humbling for me, but you always have to go through a process of learning and staying humble. So I think for anyone here, don't isolate into these boxes and fixed factions, and also maintain a sense of humility that you're always going to make mistakes, and just putting the effort forward is a great starting point, and then you'll build those connections and then relationships down the road when you find people that you want to build relationships with.
Well, Michael, thank you so very much. It's been an enlightening, informative, and fun interview. Just fantastic. There's a lot of other comments of appreciation. Neil says Laura wants to share her appreciation as well. Sarah was saying that as an educator, it was a challenge decolonizing education spaces. So she appreciated your addressing of some of those issues. Crystal has posted the book list, so I encourage everyone to check that out in the comments. And there's also a great comment here from Mark Cooney from Walk for Wenjack, addressing the fact that we're all on a journey, on our own personal journey, and together being able to learn and grow has been a real honor to have you today. So thank you so much, Michael. And thanks to everybody who's been tuning in. We will be hopefully hosting more interviews in the future, but this, October was kind of our big month, getting ready for Secret Path Week, which just wrapped up. But we encourage people to continue their learning, and also know that it's Treaties Recognition Week in Ontario next week. So there's, a lot of learning and resources out there for us to keep growing. So thanks again, Michael, and I can't wait to get your book when it comes out. Put me on the pre-order list.
Awesome. Good, Audra. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.